Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The map of disappearances, 3 years of unanswered questions, 3 years of travelers who never arrived, and a quiet widow who refused to stop asking why. The hills of southwest Missouri have always kept secrets well. In 1867, the Ozarks were a rugged and shifting frontier, thinly settled, loosely governed and treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with their crooked trails. Cattle drives passed through. Prospectors drifted between the scattered diggings. Families migrating west followed rutted wagon tracks through limestone valleys and cedar thickets. Men vanished in those hills, but men often vanished in those years. The war had ended only recently, and Missouri still wore its scars openly. Outlaw gangs, partisan grudges, and a patchwork of law enforcement held together more by habit than principle. But the pattern was there, if anyone had the patience to see it. Eudora Whitcomb had nothing left to lose, which made her patient. Her only son, Elias, had returned from California in the spring of 1864 with a belt full of gold and a plan to buy land in Illinois. He never arrived. The last letter she received, postmarked from Springfield, Missouri, mentioned a trading post along a route called Devil's Backbone, a name she hadn't noticed until later. The weeks turned into months. Letters to sheriffs, marshals, even old army acquaintances yielded no trace. The war had scattered people, the officials said. Roads were dangerous, men were robbed every day, but Eudora could not shake the feeling that what had taken her son was not chance, it was system. By late 1866, widowed, 50 years old, and with her farm sold to settle debts, she moved to Springfield, Missouri. Quietly, no announcement, no relatives informed. She rented a small single-story house with a view of the old military road, and in that dim parlor, by lamplight, she began assembling a map. At first it was only missing person notices clipped from newspapers, then letters from desperate wives and brothers who had written the same unanswered inquiries she had. From there, names collected like rainwater in a basin. Merchants, miners, itinerant teachers, men traveling alone, often carrying gold or deeds, whose journeys had taken them through a single stretch of road in the southern Ozarks. 47 cases by December, 47 men gone where their tracks should have been easy to follow. There were patterns beyond the numbers. They were always alone. They carried enough money to tempt thieves, but not enough to cause a federal uproar. They were outsiders, strangers whose absence might not be noticed for weeks. And most chilling, nearly all had stopped, or were advised to stop, at a single roadside establishment south of Springfield, a place known as Turner's Station. The Turner brothers were, by reputation, pillars of rural hospitality. Daniel and Miles Turner, Irish immigrants, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, and outwardly devout, had opened the station as a watering stop for travelers in the late months of the war. The Ozarks were dangerous country then, and Turner's offered more than water, a meal, a place to rest, directions from men who knew the hills. Eudora's files told another story. Too many missing men had last been seen or mentioned intending to stop there. Her first break came not from dusty records, but from a seamstress. On a freezing January evening in 1867, during a church social, Eudora attended to keep appearances, though she preferred quiet. She overheard a lilting Cork accent. The woman, Bridget Mallory, stitched fine linens for Springfield's wealthier households. When Eudora struck up polite conversation, Bridget mentioned, almost in passing, that the Turner brothers reminded her of 2 men she'd known as boys in County Cork, not Turners but Callahans. And the Callahan boys had not been respectable. They had been predators. Over tea days later, behind a locked door, Bridget's face went pale as she whispered what she remembered. The Callahans had run road crews, not to build but to bleed, robberies disguised as accidents. Farmers set upon in lonely gullies. A constable uncle had chased them until they disappeared, presumed to have sailed for America under new names. Those men, Bridget whispered, eyes flicking toward the curtained window, are not who they say. And what they were, God save you, Mrs. Whitcomb, they'll not hesitate to keep their secrets still. 2 weeks later, Bridget Mallory vanished from her boarding house. The landlady assumed she'd taken work in St. Louis, but Eudora knew better. The quiet woman from Illinois now understood. She was not investigating disappearances. She was inside them. She did not flee. Instead, she turned from questions of motive to questions of money. Robbery on this scale, if it was robbery, required laundering. Gold had to become paper. Paper had to become respectable. That meant banks, brokers, exchanges. For the next 6 weeks, Eudora haunted Springfield's financial district like a ghost in plain sight. A woman was easily dismissed in such places. She carried a notebook, sometimes a basket with bread or buttons, and spoke in the harmless tones of a widow managing modest affairs. But her eyes were surgical. The trail led, inevitably, to currency. Gold dust from small claims, mining outfits in implausible quantities, paper conversions in round sums that coincided with the dates men had disappeared along Devil's Backbone. At the center sat a name every merchant in Springfield knew: Abram Kettering, owner of the city's largest exchange office. Kettering dealt in all manners of currency and enjoyed a reputation for upright conduct, but his books, viewed discreetly by Eudora with the aid of a sympathetic clerk, told a different tale. Large deposits of unminted gold, frequent conversions tied to Turner's Station dates, private accounts credited to local officials who had no earthly business receiving windfalls from mining towns hundreds of miles away. The disappearances had been invisible because they were profitable, and profitable things grow roots. By February 1867, Eudora Whitcomb had a file, not accusations but a mechanism: roots, victims, profits, names, a machine hidden in the hills, its parts disguised as lawmen, merchants, and benefactors. The widow of Illinois now held evidence that could shake the Ozarks to its limestone bedrock, but to bring it forward would require someone beyond local reach, someone who could not be bribed, bullied, or silenced, and already she could feel the circle tightening. Men she did not know lingered longer near her street corner. Questions, polite but probing, began arriving from neighbors who had never before cared to speak. The Turner brothers had thrived on trust, and now they knew whom not to trust. When Captain Nathaniel Harrow read the letter, he paused halfway through, set his coffee aside, and reread it twice more. He had known Eudora's late husband, Matthew, during the war, a good man, one of the few who kept his humanity when Missouri's borders bled into anarchy. Now his widow had sent a package thick with testimony, maps, and account copies, but thin on safety. Harrow, a federal marshal based out of St. Louis, had a reputation for incorruptibility that made enemies as easily as it made allies. He understood at once what the letter implied: not random highwaymen, but a designed economy of death, shielded by polite society. He wrote back immediately: "Stay where you are, do not travel, trust no local authority. I will come quietly." By mid-March 1867, Harrow entered Springfield under an assumed name, a worn coat, and the bearing of a man on routine postal business. He met Eudora, not in her rented home, too visible, but in the basement of St. Paul's Lutheran Church, a stone-walled refuge where a sympathetic pastor understood both faith and discretion. Their meeting lasted 3 hours. Harrow did not interrupt as Eudora laid out every name, every route, every ledger she had copied by hand. She spoke in the even tone of someone long past grief, her fury transmuted into precision. By the time she finished, Harrow's hands trembled slightly as he folded the maps. "You've uncovered a business," he said finally, voice low. "Not banditry, commerce. They've built a shadow market out of human life, and they killed my boy," Eudora said. Not as an accusation but as fact, heavy and immovable. Harrow nodded, eyes narrowing. "And they've tried to kill you." There was no more time for deliberation. The Turner brothers had influence, so did Kettering, the banker at the heart of Eudora's findings. Any formal subpoena, any whisper of federal inquiry, would leak before ink dried. Harrow chose speed over ceremony. He telegraphed for a quiet detachment of trusted deputies, men whose loyalty had been bought, not with money but with blood shared in war. By March 18, 1867, the noose began to tighten, not around Eudora's neck but around the machine that had devoured so many others. At dawn, under a cover of routine commerce, federal agents moved on 3 targets simultaneously: Turner's Station, Abram Kettering's currency exchange, and the homes of 6 respectable citizens who had appeared too often in too many ledgers at too many suspicious hours. The raid at Turner's Station would haunt every man who participated. The building itself was ordinary: rough timber, iron stove, barrels of dried corn and salt pork. But the floor told another story. Beneath it lay a chamber whose walls were lined with the things murder leaves behind when it pretends not to exist: pocket watches, boots, personal letters, rings with initials that now matched names on Eudora's map, and worse, books, not one ledger, but several, each page neat, deliberate, clinical, entries that read less like theft and more like logistics. June 14, 1865, J.C. Drummond, Illinois, gold dust, approx $1,450, traveling alone, recommended Creekside Hollow Camp, collected by MT and DW split shares, Kettering 12%, Marshall A. Rude $50 cover, remainder divided 4 ways, each victim reduced to initials, value, risk assessment. One entry stopped Eudora cold when Harrow later placed it before her. March 20, 1864, E. Whitcomb, Illinois, California Fields, $3,000 in nuggets, alone. Widowed mother in Sangamon County, low inquiry risk, recommended Devil's Backbone with detour past Widow's Creek. Even the timing was there, even the casual cruelty of low inquiry risk. Her son's murder had been a line item on a balance sheet. Elsewhere in Springfield, agents found Kettering's private ledgers confirming gold-to-paper conversions far in excess of any legitimate mining output.
Names of city officials, judges, even a mayor appeared in careful shorthand, each tied to a percentage or commission. And at the home of Sheriff Alvin Rood, a man publicly trusted and privately complicit, they found letters that made the conspiracy's architecture unmistakable. Rood had not simply looked away, he had scheduled patrols to avoid crime scenes, tipped off the Turners when rumors threatened exposure, even arranged false bandit sightings to distract other investigators. One chilling letter, dated only a month earlier, read, "The Whitcomb widow has become a problem. If she travels, see that her wagon meets misfortune beyond the river. Quiet hands, no witnesses. Too much noise invites federal eyes." Harrow folded that letter and slid it silently across the church table to Eudora. She stared at it for a long while, her lips pressed together until they whitened, then handed it back without a word. The arrests were swift. The Turner brothers were dragged from their own station before breakfast, hands bound, their faces calm, too calm, like men who had calculated odds and knew there were still cards unseen. Kettering was taken in his office, attempting to burn correspondence, Rood in his nightshirt, cursing like a man betrayed not by justice but by misfortune. Interrogations peeled away the polite layers. Daniel Turner, the elder, confessed first, not out of remorse but pride disguised as resignation. "We were never highwaymen," he told Harrow, his Irish brogue curling like smoke. "Highwaymen swing from trees. We dealt in certainty. Information before bullets. That's what made it work. A man traveling with gold is only cargo until someone knows he carries it. We knew." Miles Turner spoke less, but what he said chilled even seasoned deputies. Most didn't suffer. Quick shot, clean burial, never a mark left where folks could trace. And then, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, he added, "Your boy? Brave lad. Thought to fight but we'd numbers. We gave him quick passage, cleaner than most." Eudora sat through those words with the stillness of a statue carved from grief. The scale widened with every ledger, every seized letter, every frightened confession. It was not two brothers with a taste for blood. It was a network, merchants, lawmen, civic leaders, all lubricated by gold, turned invisible through commerce. In 3 years, at least 127 men had entered the Missouri Ozarks and never come out. Their collective worth in cash and goods, over $400,000. Adjusted for the age, it was not mere theft. It was a private economy running parallel to the lawful one, invisible because its beneficiaries were the very men meant to prevent it. The trials would take months, the gallows less than an hour, but the real wound would not heal. It was not in Springfield's banks, nor on Devil's Backbone, nor even in Eudora's shattered home in Illinois. It lay in the ease, the casual civic ease, with which murder had worn a merchant's smile and a sheriff's badge. It left behind no villains out of dime novels, only neighbors who had learned to profit from disappearance. And even as federal wagons hauled prisoners east toward St. Louis, Harrow warned her quietly, "This was only one vein. You close it, others remain. The pattern moves because it pays. You've pulled a root, Eudora, not the tree." The courthouse smelled of pine soap and damp wool, but beneath the ritual of justice, the air carried something else, the metallic scent of fear from men who until weeks ago had been safe. The Turner brothers sat flanked by deputies in heavy coats despite the heat, their eyes restless, darting not toward the judge, but toward the gallery where townsfolk sat rigid, divided, and suddenly unmasked. The trial was no longer a question of guilt. The ledgers had spoken more cleanly than any witness ever could. They were precise, cold, transactional, each name a unit of value, each disappearance a line of calculated risk. What prosecutors presented was not murder in the traditional sense, it was commerce in its final, unholy efficiency. The Turner Network, as it was now openly called, operated not with knives in the dark but with the clean instruments of bureaucracy, purchase orders, false patrol schedules, notarized transfers of property from missing men to interim caretakers. It was murder, laundered through paperwork. Eudora Whitcomb sat quietly through it all. Her presence alone altered the temperature of the room. Men who had once dismissed her now spoke of her in lowered voices, like she carried an infection of truth. Women wept as details emerged, not only for the victims but for the way their own husbands had silently navigated profit around slaughter. On the 4th day of testimony, Abram Kettering broke. The banker who had once walked with a silver-headed cane now sat hunched, hands twisting a handkerchief until it tore. He named names. He described meetings in upper rooms of hotels, deals struck over coffee while the city slept, judges paid in discreet coin purses delivered by messengers, and then he uttered a number that froze the room. "Gentlemen," Kettering whispered, his voice brittle, "what we took in gold was nothing compared to what we were paid not to see. Our patrons were not all merchants. Some were men in Washington, not high men, but federal men. You think our books end in Springfield?" Judge Lemuel Tarrant leaned forward, his gavel forgotten. "Mr. Kettering," he said carefully, "are you implying that federal officials knowingly engaged in this conspiracy?"
Kettering stared at the table, I imply nothing. I state a fact. We paid for silence, and silence was purchased. The courtroom became a hive of whispers. For the first time, the terror shifted, not merely for the dead, but for the living, for the realization that justice had entered a house whose foundation was rot. Captain Harrow, who sat at the rear to avoid notice, exchanged a glance with one of his deputies. Neither spoke, but both knew what it meant. The investigation had outgrown Missouri. It had become federal, not by jurisdiction, but by contamination. Eudora felt it too. That night, in the rented parsonage where she now slept, Harrow warned her in a low, even voice. "You've done what you came for," he said. "The men who killed your boy will hang. But this thing stretches further than a rope can reach. If you stay, you'll become a name in one of their ledgers. Maybe not here, maybe Nebraska, maybe Texas, but the system will correct itself, violently." She did not flinch. "And if I leave?" Harrow stared at the wall. "Then you live. You speak when asked, but you don't dig. The ground you're standing on is already turning to mud." For the first time, Eudora allowed herself to weep, not for justice won, but for justice deferred, scattered like seeds into fields where she might never see the harvest. The following morning, the Turner brothers were sentenced to hang. Their execution was scheduled for August 3rd. The town prepared with a mixture of grim duty and morbid curiosity, knowing that no rope would strangle the questions that now spread faster than rumor. But the gallows did not wait quietly. 2 nights before the execution, Miles Turner requested to speak with Eudora. Against Harrow's advice, she agreed, meeting him in the jail under heavy guard. Miles sat in chains, his once proud bearing reduced, though his eyes retained a peculiar calm. "You think you've killed the beast," he said softly. "You've only cut the tongue. The throat still breathes." Eudora remained silent. "They'll hang me and my brother," Miles continued, "but the roots will stay. The buyers will pay. The law will look away when it profits. All you've done is draw a circle of blood around Missouri. The rest of the map stays dark." She stared at him, her jaw tight. "You murdered my son." He nodded once, solemnly. "And you murdered the market. We're even in the eyes of men, but markets return." Eudora rose, said nothing, and left. On August 3rd, the brothers were executed at dawn. The crowd that gathered did not cheer. They watched in silence as the bodies dropped, as the necks broke, as gravity delivered its final arithmetic. The Turner bodies were buried outside consecrated ground. No stone, no marker, only a shallow ridge in clay soil where rain pooled and insects gathered. But 3 weeks later, a railroad crew clearing timber north of Devil's Backbone found bones, then more bones. 47 sets of remains unearthed in a crude pit, each stripped of valuables, each skull bearing the same small, neat hole at the base. Among them were men presumed drowned, robbed elsewhere, or simply lost. Names now matched numbers in ledgers, and in that grisly alignment, a more terrible truth surfaced. Even in their confessions, the Turners had lied. The brothers had admitted to 127 murders. The grave suggested more, perhaps many more. Harrow filed his reports under seal. Federal men arrived, then disappeared with evidence, boxes of documents, and, disturbingly, several bodies. When Eudora pressed for explanation, Harrow only shook his head. "This is beyond me now," he said. "Whatever survives of this case belongs to Washington. You won't see it again." And she never did. By winter, Springfield returned to its commerce. Travelers once again rode through, cautious but willing. The trading post at Turner's Station was burned, rebuilt, failed, and left to rot in the weeds like a wound never fully closed. Yet the unease remained. Folks avoided Devil's Backbone after dusk. Mothers warned children not to stray off the new road. Men who had once laughed at ghost stories now avoided conversation when the subject of the Turners arose, not because of haunting, because of memory. Because the silence of a town complicit in blood is a silence that does not fade. It curdles. Eudora Whitcomb left Missouri in December 1867. Her letters to Harrow continued for 7 years, each quieter than the last, until the correspondence ceased. Her notes, however, lived on, passed privately among historians, archivists, and later lawmen who recognized patterns too uncanny to dismiss. The silence after, St. Louis 1874, 7 years later. The letter bore no return name, only a county mark that Harrow recognized immediately, Sangamon, Illinois. Inside was a single page, written in the same precise hand he had first encountered in that church basement years ago. "Nathaniel, I no longer keep watch for justice, only for patterns. They return, in quieter forms. If Missouri was a noise, these are whispers, but the mathematics match. Same disappearances, same demographics, same language in property transfers. Only the surnames are different. I fear the map is wider than I ever feared." EW. He read it twice, then set it down, staring through the window as freight cars rattled through the yard below. He had told her to leave it. He had told himself the noose and the grave had been enough. But the bones at Devil's Backbone had said otherwise. And now this. By 1874, the Civil War's embers had cooled into industry. Railroads stitched the frontier to the coasts, and towns rose overnight on speculation and rumor. Men carried fortunes westward, often alone, often trusting strangers whose only qualification for trust was proximity. It was the same soil, only tilled deeper. Harrow had retired from federal service in '72, a body worn thin by travel and politics, but he had not forgotten. He had kept a personal file locked beneath the floorboards of his St. Louis home. Names, dates, copies of ledgers seized before Washington claimed them. He read from them when sleep eluded him, not out of nostalgia, but to remind himself what comfort costs when bought with silence. Now, with Eudora's letter in hand, the weight returned. He boarded a train, north under a different name. What he found in Illinois chilled him not with violence but with familiarity. The disappearances had begun along the Sangamon River. Young men, widowed men, those without strong local ties, the same low-inquiry risk categories that Turner ledgers had once catalogued like livestock. Notice posted in newspapers painted them as unlucky, victims of river crossings or bad weather. Yet the property shifts told another story, a slow siphon of land and coin into the hands of two families whose names appeared again and again. And in the county archives among probate filings, he found a familiar rhythm of handwriting. Not the same man, not even the same county clerk, but the same cadence of forgery, deliberate, quiet, deadly. He returned to St. Louis sick with recognition. Washington would not move. He knew that now. Too many careers had depended on burying the Turner affair, on presenting it as a freakish Missouri aberration, not a design. To admit the pattern meant admitting a failure not of law, but of governance. So Harrow did what broken men sometimes do. He wrote, not for newspapers, those were bought, not for courts, those were tired. He wrote for the future, in leather-bound journals labeled only by year and place, each entry a testimony stripped of names but fat with implication. He documented, cross-referenced, hypothesized. He wrote like a man afraid of dying with the truth trapped in his skull. The last entry, dated September 2nd, 1891, reads, "They have learned subtlety. The knife replaced by deed transfers, the shot replaced by debt foreclosure. No longer does a body fall on the Devil's Backbone. It vanishes in paperwork and polite handshakes. But the engine is the same. Identify the lonely, extract the valuable, erase the inquiry. It is commerce with murder folded flat, thin enough to slip beneath the conscience of a nation hungry for growth. If these words are ever read, do not look only in Missouri. The tree was never regional. It is perennial. It moves with the rails, with the roads, with the laws that prize property over presence. What we hanged in Springfield were gardeners, not architects. Harrow died 3 weeks later. Natural causes, the obituary claimed. The journals vanished from his home. No break-in, no sign of theft, only absence where something once lay heavy beneath the floor. Eudora Whitcomb's trail ends in 1894. Her death certificate lists pneumonia. Among her effects, donated posthumously to the Illinois Historical Society, were several hand-drawn maps marked with tiny, neat crosses, margins filled with dates, arrows connecting counties hundreds of miles apart. In a separate envelope, a single unfinished letter, to whom it may concern. If you are reading this, then what I feared has returned in full. Missouri was a spark, but I have traced the fire across 3 states, each a mirror of the last. The victims change, the methods refine, but the principle holds, a community conspiring to profit from disappearance while wearing the face of respectability. I write not to solve, but to warn. These are not men in alleys, they are men in offices, men at pulpits, men shaking hands with sheriffs and judges. They require no violence where trust suffices. I do not know how to end what thrives in secrecy and reward. I only know that I have seen its branches touch Colorado, Nebraska, Texas, and I fear it will not stop. The letter ends mid-sentence, the ink pooled at a place where her hand must have slipped. Today, historians speak of the Turner affair as though it were an isolated brutality born of frontier chaos. Textbooks reduce it to a cautionary footnote in the lawlessness of post-war Missouri. But the private papers, Harrow's fragments, Whitcomb's maps, the sealed federal boxes rumored but never catalogued, suggest something else, a blueprint, not an outbreak, and the silence surrounding it is not the silence of closure. It is the silence of complicity, the kind that grows thicker with each generation until the story feels like folklore, and the folklore feels like safety. But the pattern waits. The anatomy of disappearance. Washington City, autumn 1895. The archive room in the basement of the Treasury building did not look like a crime scene. It looked like bureaucracy, polished oak,
iron racks, the faint odor of ink, lamp oil and stale paper. But to the two junior clerks ordered to inventory miscellaneous estate records that autumn, it felt wrong almost at once. The boxes came from Missouri originally, though the handwriting on their tags was federal, tight, upright, indifferent. Inside were ledgers, a few charred scraps of correspondence, several unmarked envelopes containing uncashed drafts drawn against banks that no longer existed. It was not the contents that chilled the clerks, but the instructions. Each box bore a slip reading simply, property, retain, access, restricted, transfer, none, notes destroy if audit demands, no signature, no departmental stamp. Within 3 weeks the contents were gone, no record of their disposal, no receipt. The room reshelved as if the boxes had never been, but before they vanished, a single clerk copied 3 pages by hand, not out of courage but curiosity, pages that would eventually leak to a quiet circle of historians in the next century. Those pages revealed something no official ever admitted. The Missouri affair had been dissected like a cadaver. The first page read like notes from a physician trying to understand a disease. Patient, rural county network. Duration 36 months minimum. Mechanism, identification, diversion, extraction, disposal, obfuscation. Vectors, local law, commerce, civic trust. Result, 127 plus confirmed deaths. Undetermined asset total. Prognosis, highly adaptable, requires systemic intervention. The second page was worse. It mapped migration, arrows from Missouri into 4 states, dates and initials beside each, followed by terse evaluations. Colorado, mining corridors, viable. Nebraska, rail spurs, active. Texas, coastal exchange, confirmed. Illinois, river traffic, contained, pending. And the third page carried what looked like a question, though no question mark followed it. Integration preferable to eradication, if operational control can be assured. There was no signature, only a date, February 4th, 1868. What the federal men had not destroyed, they had learned from. By the turn of the century, the pattern had evolved. Gone were the crude ambushes, the messy graves. Disappearance became clerical. Men died on paper first. Land deeds shifted while their owners still drew breath, trapped in debt that no sheriff questioned because the signatures matched. Never mind that the signatures were forged by men in the same offices paid to verify them. It was, in effect, perfect. No crime scene, no body, no inquiry. Only a slow siphoning of value from the unconnected toward the already powerful, each death disguised as a natural misfortune, each theft laundered through legality until it gleamed. Eudora's unfinished letter hinted at this, though she never used the language of disease, but those leaked pages from Washington confirmed it. The Turner blueprint had not been buried, it had been absorbed, refined, bureaucratized. One historian who handled the copies decades later wrote in the margin, "This reads less like criminal discovery than corporate prototype." In the Missouri files, what few escaped destruction, the surgical nature of the crimes became clearer. Every step, every decision point had been optimized for plausible deniability. Selection. Victims were identified not by wealth alone, but by their statistical invisibility. Widowers, migrants, men without close kin or local ties. Diversion. They were steered, politely, onto routes controlled by conspirators, roads that dead-ended in convenience. Extraction. Violence was clean, often single-shot, assets catalogued before blood cooled. Disposal. Graves remote, unmarked, often layered, more than one body per pit, a cruel economy of space. Obfuscation. False trails planted, official inquiries redirected, sometimes with planted bandits hanged as theater. It was not savagery, it was engineering. And perhaps most terrifying of all was the philosophy underneath. Not hatred, not desperation, but calculation. Daniel Turner, in one of his calmer depositions, said it plainly. A man alone with gold is no different from a mule with a loaded pack. He invites transfer. Nature despises waste. Federal notes preserved that line in quotation marks, not to condemn it, to remember it. By 1902, when construction crews unearthed the mass grave north of Devil's Backbone, no one in authority was surprised. Disturbed, yes, publicly, but not surprised. The missing count had always been wrong. The pit only confirmed the scale that old men like Harrow and widows like Whitcomb had tried to warn them of. The coroner's report for those remains, filed in Springfield, bore an unusual closing sentence. Further excavation not recommended, area unstable, subject to collapse. Unofficially, federal men were seen on site that night, removing certain remains, cataloging others, then ordering the pit filled and the area fenced off under the guise of safety. Locals were told the matter closed. Privately, the ledgers, what fragments survived, were cross-checked against the new bones. 34 matched, 13 did not. 13 bodies with no initials, no recorded value, no trace in any known book. They were not mistakes. They were ghosts, evidence of transactions that had never been reported even within the conspiracy. Speculation among the few honest historians runs cold. Either there were killings the Turners hid even from their own ledgers, or there were others, parallel networks operating under the same principle, overlapping, invisible except where graves intersected like seams in a shroud. One federal note, undated, unsigned, found in a separate box in 1921, reads only, multiple models confirmed. Missouri iteration not unique. National survey recommended, classified until integration complete. Integration, the same word from that old leaked page. As if murder for profit were not an aberration to be crushed but a feature to be managed. Today nothing remains of Turner's Station but root-choked depressions where timbers rotted and a thin scatter of iron nails that rise to the surface after heavy rain like accusations no one cares to answer. The trail itself is now state land, accessible only by foot, a curiosity for hikers with strong stomachs and a taste for unsolved histories. But those who have walked it speak of a feeling difficult to describe, not haunting in the supernatural sense, but a pressure, as if the woods themselves disapprove of footsteps. It is not fear of ghosts. It is the memory of systems that smiled, shook hands, poured water for travelers, and then erased them as efficiently as coins exchanged at a counter. A few locals still tell the story to children, a tale stripped of names and politics, reduced to moral warning, never trust a kindness you cannot verify. But the journals, the letters, the leaked pages, they suggest something bleaker, that the kindness you can verify may yet be the kindness that kills you.
Experiments in Trust. St. Louis, winter 1896. By the time the Turner case had become a teaching file rather than an open wound, a subtle shift had already taken root in how federal men discussed such crimes. They no longer spoke of them solely in the language of murder or theft. They spoke in the language of systems. The lesson, unspoken but learned, was that community itself could be weaponized, that the social glue which held towns and trade routes together could be shaped into a snare as surely as rope into a noose. In a memorandum dated December 12, 1896, a special agent identified only as C. Brandt compiled observations from the Missouri investigation into what he called social leverage experiments. The memo, preserved only because a junior clerk bound it accidentally into a volume of tariff abstracts, laid out a cold, methodical study in human behavior. Approach. Aid offered in a moment of perceived vulnerability is accepted at a rate exceeding 90%. Transfer of direction. Once initial trust is granted, victims obey even indirect suggestions regarding routes, accommodations, or timing. Delay of suspicion. Even after harm occurs, survivors blame externalities, weather, bandits' mechanical fault, rather than suspecting the helpful party. Authority shield. Civic reputation serves as armor. The more a suspect contributes publicly, the less likely he is questioned privately. Brandt's language was not that of a prosecutor. It was that of a mechanic describing a repeatable process. He ended the memo with a single, almost clinical observation. The Missouri sequence, while morally abhorrent, reveals that human trust functions predictably under stress. Any network with control over both guidance and verification may convert travelers into assets without recourse to overt force. Nowhere in the surviving correspondence is there evidence that federal officials ever intended to copy what the Turners had done. But nowhere either is there evidence of revulsion sufficient to prevent curiosity. The same names appear in both columns, men who prosecuted with vigor, then quietly advised rail and shipping syndicates how best to structure information flows along their routes. And in that interstice between law and commerce, between morality and expediency, something uncanny emerged, a bureaucratic willingness to treat atrocity not as anomaly, but as data. Eudora Whitcomb's private notes, written years later in a scrawl made jagged by arthritis, confirm her growing unease. She had returned to Illinois, remarried, even raised grandchildren who never knew the smell of grief that had once haunted her. Yet she kept, hidden under floorboards, a bundle of letters stamped simply with federal seals. One, dated March 1898, read in part, "Mrs. Whitcomb, you are advised with deepest respect that certain matters once entrusted to you now fall under review of a higher order. You are under no suspicion, however. Discretion remains imperative. The work undertaken in Greene County will not be repeated in its crude form, but the principles learned therein hold value to interests not criminal, but national." She underlined that last phrase twice in pencil, not criminal, but national. No one knows if she replied. Her papers stopped there, mid-decade, as if a quiet hand had closed the chapter for her. Meanwhile, in the files that escape destruction, a peculiar pattern appears. Requests from rail consortiums for passenger profile studies use phrases eerily similar to Brandt's memo. Riverboat lines sought risk mitigation modeling that cross-referenced solitude, cash carriage, and likelihood of delayed report, not to harm passengers, officially, only to protect them, to allocate security efficiently, to harden routes. But if one could protect with such data, one could also exploit.
That ambiguity, that dual-use dread, is the marrow of the Turner legacy. For every lawman who used the lessons to shield innocence, another saw in them a business model, controlled scarcity, directed flow, selective disappearance that enriched those positioned to certify the paperwork afterward. In 1901, an internal Treasury circular, circulated among only 8 senior men, included a blunt acknowledgement: it is preferable that we understand the mechanics of removal, even if we cannot always prevent its occurrence. Patterns discovered may be useful in domains beyond commerce. No context, no apology. The Missouri Ozarks had become, in the span of a generation, less a scar than a syllabus, and somewhere in those woods the graves still lay, mute, heavy, unreconciled, while above them, men in distant offices translated human cruelty into bullet points. One veteran agent, interviewed anonymously in 1924 for a university study on frontier law, summed it up with weary candor. The trouble with Missouri wasn't the killing. Killing we understood. It was the paperwork that came after. It was how neat it all was. You could read those ledgers and think you were looking at shipping manifests, not murder tallies. And once you see murder written like inventory, you never quite look at inventory the same way again. By then the Turner brothers were folklore, reduced to specters with lanterns on moonless roads, or whispers of poisoned wells. But in the documents, in the grainy penciled margins of reports never meant for public eyes, their names had become shorthand for something else entirely, a proof of concept. Ledger of the Departed, Jefferson City, spring 1903. The ledger did not belong in a courthouse. Its leather was too soft, its clasp too fine, its weight too intentional. But there it sat, on the desk of a state archivist, whose name has been lost to the slow erosion of bureaucratic paper trails. Eudora Whitcomb's estate, quietly settled in March of that year, included trunks of correspondence, legal briefs, and a handful of bound volumes that had not been catalogued. Among them was a ledger that no one, to this day, will claim to have created. Its first half looked like any respectable register of property transactions: dates, names, acreages, sale prices, neat columns of ink. The second half was something else. The headings remained the same: name, origin, value, disposition, but the entries were human: travelers, laborers, families, names from Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, ages ranged from 16 to 64. Under value were figures, not in dollars, but in coded abbreviations, as if reducing lives to units of logistical worth, and under disposition, in an elegant but unflinching script: cleansed, transferred, settled, absorbed, closed. Some lines had no words at all, just a single heavy dash, as if the pen itself hesitated and then moved on. What made the ledger chilling was not only what it contained, but what it aligned with. Researchers who cross-referenced its entries against missing person notices from the period found a grim symmetry. 12 names matched known disappearances along Ozark routes between 1867 and 1871. 5 corresponded to river passengers never seen again after docking in Greene County. At least 3 were names that had, in earlier investigations, been ruled likely lost to banditry elsewhere, but the dates were wrong. The disappearances had been scattered, attributed to a dozen unconnected causes across multiple states. The ledger placed them in Missouri, often days, sometimes weeks earlier than any official report had guessed. The conclusion, reluctant but inevitable, was that the Turner operation had run wider than confession or indictment ever dared to suggest. A handwritten note pinned to the final page, unsigned but bearing the brittle indentation of an official seal, read simply: "Not all roads are made of earth. Some are made of silence. Let the silence hold." The state, unwilling to reopen a case long closed and politically costly, did not publish the ledger. Instead, it was sealed in a climate-controlled vault, labeled only as Restricted Item 2047 DUP, alongside territorial treaties and obsolete tax codes no one requested. But knowledge has a way of slipping under doors. By summer, rumors reached Washington, and from Washington the rail syndicates. Quietly, discreetly, men in suits who had never soiled their boots in Ozark clay requested summaries. Not the names, the patterns. One executive from a St. Louis shipping combine is recorded in a private diary discovered decades later in an attic, remarking, "If men can be moved without force, only suggestion, and neither state nor kin notice in time to matter, then commerce itself has learned a new lever." Meanwhile, in the hills, locals noticed changes too subtle to publish, but too persistent to ignore. The Devil's Backbone Trail, once avoided out of superstition, became the subject of targeted land purchases. Properties adjacent to old Turner holdings shifted hands 3, sometimes 4 times in a single year. Deeds moved through shell owners, some of whom did not exist outside ink. A century later, those parcels still show irregularities in tax and title. Some remain unclaimed. Some generate revenue that no municipal office can trace. It is in this tangle of record and rumor that the Turner brothers became more than killers. They became, in effect, the prototype for a system of controlled disappearance, a template later adapted by smugglers, corrupt sheriffs, and wartime intelligence units, whose names remain classified. Eudora, long dead by then, could not have known how her meticulous archiving would feed the machine she had once tried to dismantle. Her children inherited none of it, only the brittle respectability of a family name politely not discussed in Springfield parlors. But her grandson, Thomas Whitcomb Jr., would one day find himself summoned to testify in secret before a congressional subcommittee. His opening remark, recorded only in shorthand, still chills those few historians who have managed to retrieve it. "Gentlemen, you have asked about ghosts, but what we learned in Missouri is that ghosts are just debts unpaid in human form." He declined further comment. By then the ledger had already been copied, photographed, studied, not as crime evidence but as a map of how to move people like cargo through a society too polite or too frightened to admit it could happen. The quiet horror of Part 7 is that the Turner case no longer belonged to the Turners. It belonged to anyone willing to learn from it, and learn they did. The Hollow Roads, Springfield, autumn 1907. The sound of wheels on gravel is a kind of heartbeat. In the Ozarks of the early 20th century, that heartbeat had slowed. Stagecoaches gave way to private wagons, then to motor cars that rattled more than they hummed. Yet one thing did not change. People still asked where to turn, where to rest, whom to trust. By then, what had been the Turner affair had sunk into the soil like rain. No indictments remained open, no monument stood, but the void it left, the learned reflex to trust, twisted and studied, began to manifest in ways no sheriff's badge could contain. Records from the Springfield Bureau of Transportation note a peculiar uptick in route advisories, informal detours that travelers were encouraged to take. Most led nowhere unusual. Some, however, led into hollows where no inn existed, where no ferry waited, where the only sign of recent life was a fire burned low in a pit and a smell, not of death but of boiled cloth, as if someone had cleaned something in haste. The ledger, as later cross-referenced, hinted at this next phase. In the margins, beside several names, were faint notations: Oxbow, Cinder Hill, 4 South, each cryptic to anyone not already initiated. When a minor postmaster, Andrew Klein, went missing in October 1907, it should have been an ordinary matter, a horse thrown, a river crossing misjudged. But Klein's mailbag surfaced weeks later, dry and intact, in a depot 50 miles away, every letter delivered save one, a sealed packet addressed to the U.S. Marshal's office. Its contents, reconstructed from an incomplete carbon, appear to have been a warning. Klein wrote of roadmen, not robbers, of assistance offered that directs a man not forward but inward, of faces known to law yet unknown to charge. He ended with a single line: "The Turners are gone, but the Turners were a seed." That phrase, once filed and forgotten, would reappear in classified reviews in 3 separate decades, each time underlined, each time unanswered. Federal investigators did return to Greene County quietly in December of that year. The team consisted of 4 men, 2 from Washington, 1 from St. Louis, 1 from Chicago. Their report, redacted to near uselessness, mentions only confirmatory environmental cues, inconclusive witness interviews, and no actionable evidence of criminal conspiracy. Yet in a personal diary, later sold at a state auction, one of those men wrote bluntly, "The paths have been cut twice since we rode them last. Someone is maintaining roads that lead nowhere but meet every requirement of a route. Not bandits, not ranchers. This is a grid without a map." He returned to Washington, requested reassignment, and never spoke publicly of Missouri again. Meanwhile, travelers disappeared in small numbers, never enough to demand headlines, always enough to feed whispers. A family from Indiana vanished en route to Arkansas in 1908. A lumber merchant from Kansas left St. Louis with cash and papers, and never checked into his booked lodgings in Branson. In each case, local law enforcement cited banditry, runaway debt, or voluntary flight. But in each case, a common detail flickered like a ghost through testimony. Someone had offered help, directions, a safe place to water horses, a shortcut to beat the weather, and each time, the helper's name dissolved upon inquiry. No stableman remembered him, no tavern swore to his presence, yet every traveler swore he seemed respectable. By 1910, insurance firms had begun to factor Ozark attrition into premium models for freight and passenger movement through southern Missouri. They did not list it by name, of course. They called it unresolved transit loss. But in actuarial language, that phrase is an admission. Something systemic, not incidental, was at work. One retired agent, speaking decades later under oath to a committee that barely understood the geography in question, put it this way: "We didn't lose wagons. We lost faith. You can guard a wagon. You can't guard a man's willingness to believe the voice that sounds like home." It was in that context that a classified memorandum, now partially declassified, reached the Attorney General in November 1911. It recommended, in terms both bureaucratic and blunt, that prolonged pursuit of the matter risks greater exposure of methods than resolution of the underlying activity. The patterns suggest continuity of practice without clear organizational anchor. Any decisive action may disperse rather than disrupt the behavior, rendering further detection improbable. The matter, in effect, has become self-propagating. In plainer language, what had begun with two brothers on a lonely trail had become a culture, a behavior transmitted not by bloodline or signature, but by opportunity recognized and copied. The Turner affair was no longer a closed case, it was an ecology, somewhere between Springfield and Branson, in those bends where the hills swallow sound, and even birds fly wide. The old logic still functioned: offer help, earn trust, control movement, remove without trace. The mechanism had outlived the men. A photograph survives from around this time, date scratched in haste, November 3, 1912. In the corner of the frame, almost an accident, a fourth figure stands, barely in focus, holding what appears to be a water bucket. The face, blurred by motion, could be anyone, but the way the shoulders angle, half welcome, half guard, chills every historian who studied it. The weight of silence. By the time congressional eyes turned, reluctantly, toward Missouri again, the Turner case was already a ghost in 3 layers of government filing systems. It was a murder case in the state archives, a logistical anomaly in the Treasury's freight models, and a psychological curiosity in Justice Department memoranda that treated trust like a disease vector. What brought it back into daylight, however briefly, was not compassion, it was embarrassment. 2 federal couriers, carrying bond certificates between St. Louis and Little Rock, vanished with both the documents and their wagon driver. The certificates resurfaced months later in a Chicago bank vault, intact, as though someone had wanted the theft known but the loss contained. The only clue, repeated in deposition after deposition, was the same chilling banality: they had accepted help from a man who seemed respectable. When the Attorney General's office finally convened a closed-session inquiry, they summoned not sheriffs, not marshals, but economists and railroad men. They asked questions not of who killed, but of how routes could be bent, invisibly to serve ends other than their maps implied. The minutes of that inquiry survive in fragments, recovered decades later from a burned-out records warehouse. They read less like a criminal proceeding, and more like a seminar in controlled disappearance.
The Missouri instance demonstrates that community cover is the most effective asset. Remove the visible threat, retain the hospitable frame, prosecution risks decentralization, containment preferable to disruption, trust remains the most efficient vector, coercion introduces noise, delay, and witnesses. The language is bloodless, but the implications drip. These were not men frightened by murder, they were men frightened by loss of control. Somewhere in those rooms, a quiet, terrible consensus emerged that the network, if it could still be called that, was no longer dismantleable. It did not need leaders or ledgers anymore. It was simply a learned habit distributed across geography like a spore. Wherever transit, desperation, and polite helpfulness intersected, the same pattern could bloom. To go after it would be like hunting fog with a rope, and so they didn't. Instead, a doctrine of minimized exposure hardened like frost across departments. Files were sealed, not out of shame, but out of administrative pragmatism. Too many cases, too many jurisdictions, too few clean lines of prosecution. A single internal memo typed in faint ink captured the turning point. Public revelation would induce panic disproportionate to the hazard. Statistical analysis indicates that travelers remain largely unaffected when unaware of historical precedent. Continued monitoring recommended. Direct interdiction unlikely to yield systemic improvement. Translation: tell no one, watch quietly and let the machine run where it must. In the Ozarks, life went on. Children grew, roads paved, rivers bridged, farms sold, schools built, rail spurs retired. But certain trails never found asphalt, certain bends never saw signage, and every few years a rider, a wagon, an automobile failed to arrive. Local papers wrote of overturned buggies, flooded crossings, wolf packs. Families whispered of ghosts, of cursed springs, of wells that drank men whole. But the mechanism, offer, trust, divert, erase, remained the same, too elegant, too human to die of natural causes. Eudora Whitcomb had once written, late at night, that what frightened her most was not the killing but the ease, how little force it took to undo a life, how much of murder could be accomplished with kindness, with timing, with a smile in the right weather. Decades later, a Justice Department researcher, assigned briefly to a cold case review, scrawled a note in the margin of an old Turner file. We think of evil as violent, but efficiency has no morals. The ledger remained in Vault Tundry 47, copies leaked upward, never outward. Scholars who stumbled too near were quietly redirected, offered more promising grants, given archives with cleaner mysteries. And yet, like the faint chemical burn of old ink, the story never quite disappeared. Retired agents told it in coded fragments over bourbon. Freight dispatchers warned new hires with half-jokes about never taking water on the wrong trail. The seed, as Klein had written, had sprouted, not in the soil but in the social code, in the blind spot where decency and convenience met opportunism. By the winter of 1915, the matter was officially no longer a matter. It was a risk model, a tolerable imperfection in the vast machinery of American movement. It existed in a category the bureaucrats called ambient hazard, not to be eradicated, only mitigated by awareness among those paid to notice. For everyone else, the merchants, the settlers, the travelers, the danger became folklore. Stories of lantern-lit trails, of men who smiled too easily, of crossroads where the trees leaned in like eavesdroppers. Parents told children to stay on the main roads. Pastors cautioned against the temptation of shortcuts offered by strangers. But no one, not in public, spoke of the Turners by name anymore. Their memory had been laundered out of the record, reduced to an unmarked footnote in a series of logistical policy shifts no traveler would ever read. And so the hills kept their secret, the echo in the hills. Missouri Ozarks, present day. Time, they say, smooths even the sharpest stones, but in the Ozarks, time tends to bury rather than erase. A century and a half after the Turner boys were hanged in Springfield, the towns they touched are still standing, but only just. The farms are thinner, the roads straighter, the forests thicker. What remains unchanged are the stories, stripped of dates and names, but heavy with caution. Ask an old man at a gas station off Route 160 if he's ever heard of a spring where travelers went missing, and he'll nod, slowly, as though deciding whether to trust you. He may not recall Turner, or Whitcomb, or the name of any marshal or magistrate who tried to intervene, but he will tell you about water that costs more than thirst. He might gesture toward a logging road that isn't on your GPS, a hairline of gravel that curves like a question mark into the trees. Don't take it, he'll say, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understands that some knowledge is best accepted, not challenged. Folklore, yes, but folklore born of a very real wound. In university libraries, the classified Turner material is still sealed. Requests for access are redirected, delayed, or quietly denied. Officially, the case remains a fragment, its central network never acknowledged in any public report. Unofficially, it has become a kind of professional ghost story inside law enforcement, a cautionary tale about what happens when a conspiracy is too efficient to leave fingerprints. Retired U.S. Marshals have described off-record incidents in the 1950s and 70s that felt eerily familiar. Truckers who accepted help on quiet state roads and vanished. Livestock haulers diverted to safer crossings that ended in catastrophic loss with no culprit found. Modern analysts call it pattern bleed, the residue of a tactic that no longer requires its original architects. The mechanics persist because they were simple, profitable, and human. Not an organization, but a habit passed in silence. The bones unearthed by a railroad crew in 1909, the 47 sets of remains along a decommissioned wagon route, the single rusted wagon wheel discovered in 1983 by hikers near Devil's Bluff. None of these finds drew national headlines. They were footnotes, curiosities, sometimes even mislabeled as Civil War casualties or storm disasters. But every so often, in quiet corridors of federal buildings, the name Turner still floats up. Sometimes in training slides on corruption vulnerability, sometimes in academic papers that almost make it to publication before being pulled, sometimes as a whispered reminder that the greatest weapon of a predator is not force, it is the belief, stubborn and universal, that a stranger who smiles cannot mean harm. Eudora Whitcomb's private notes, preserved only because a distant relative refused to burn them, end on a single line written in a shaky hand, years after the trials. I thought I was fighting men. I was wrong. I was fighting a method, and that method, the quiet offer of safety, the small rerouting of a journey, the vanishing without spectacle, has never truly gone extinct. Today, Hellhound Crossing is just a hollow in the Ozark woods. No signage, no trail markers, a dry well half swallowed by roots. If you stand there at dusk, the birds stop early. The air feels a degree colder than the surrounding ridge. There is no evidence, no smell, no sound, only the weight of knowing. Locals still give the area a wide berth, not out of fear of ghosts but of patterns. As one county deputy told a visiting researcher in 2012, you can clear every suspect, burn every record, pave every road, but if someone wanted to do it again, you wouldn't stop them by name. You'd have to stop the belief that people are safe just because someone offers to help. That belief remains America's softest underbelly. And so, in the end, the Turner conspiracy did what all perfect crimes do. It dissolved into culture.
No central villain, no surviving map, no company to sue or burn, just a lingering caution, traded across generations in whispers and jokes, in the way a driver quickens their speed when the woods grow too quiet, in the instinctive glance at a stranger who offers a shortcut too eagerly. Whether the full truth was ever documented, no one outside a handful of archivists can say. The files are stamped declassified pending review. The review date has been moved 4 times. Historians still argue over the numbers. Was it dozens, hundreds? Were the Turners local entrepreneurs of death or one cell of a larger design? Were there successors or merely imitators born from reading newspaper clippings too closely? The case at its coldest is not about death counts, it's about trust. It's about how a republic built on neighborliness discovered too late that hospitality can be weaponized with terrifying efficiency. And perhaps most unsettling of all, no one can quite agree whether the network died or merely became invisible. The road through Hellhound Crossing no longer appears on maps, but from the ridge above, on certain mornings when the fog sits heavy, you can still see the faint curve of it, like a scar on the land itself, a reminder that what we forget is never truly gone. And in the hush of those woods, it's hard not to feel watched. The most dangerous criminals, after all, are rarely the ones who threaten. They're the ones who offer help and mean none of it. What do you think? Was the Turner conspiracy truly extinguished, or did it simply change names, faces, and routes? Leave your theory in the comments. We'd love to know what you believe happened in those silent Missouri hills. If you found this series as chilling as the archives that inspired it, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the bell for more stories history tried to bury, and share this with someone who still believes that kindness is always safe.